The moment hung in the air like static before a storm. Mike Pompeo leaned forward, voice cutting sharp, laced with the authority of someone too used to going unchallenged. He struck at Jasmine Crockett's record, his words dripping with accusation and condescension. The attack was meant to wound, to silence, to cast her as small in the shadow of his self-assured presence. The audience shifted uncomfortably. Cameras zoomed in. Headlines were already being drafted in real time. And then the room went quiet. Every pair of eyes, whether in the chamber or on screens across America, locked on Jasmine. For a heartbeat, she didn't move, didn't flinch. The silence became unbearable, as though the entire country was waiting to see if she would stumble, if she would fold under the weight of a former Secretary of State trying to bulldoze her reputation. But Jasmine Crockett was not built to bow. She inhaled, shoulders squared, gaze unwavering, and when she finally opened her mouth, her words didn't just answer Pompeo, they rewrote the script entirely. The clash, once tipped heavily in his favor, suddenly felt like a headline waiting to break in her direction. The room went quiet. One reporter would later write until Jasmine spoke. Her reply wasn't long, but it landed with a precision that cut sharper than Pompeo's bluster. While the audience gasped, some even cheered softly under their breath. Because in that single exchange, the stage shifted, the power balance recalibrated. America was reminded of something Pompeo had underestimated. Jasmine Crockett's voice was not just her weapon, it was her shield. Social media would soon erupt. Clips of Pompeo's smirk freezing into silence would loop endlessly. Hashtags would ignite. And yet, even in that opening spark, everyone could sense this wasn't just another political spat. Something bigger was brewing, something raw, electric, and unforgettable. Because while Pompeo's attack was calculated to diminish, Jasmine's reply carried the weight of truth, dignity, and fire. And the question now, burning in every viewer's mind, wasn't just what had she said? It was what would happen next, when the silence of one man gave way to the roar of a movement, and as that roar began to rise, it became clear. This was no ordinary political clash. In American politics, not every clash is created equal. Some exchanges flicker briefly before fading into obscurity. But when Mike Pompeo, the Republican heavyweight who once stood at the helm of U.S. foreign policy, trained his attack on Jasmine Crockett, it was instantly clear this moment belonged to a different category. This wasn't a skirmish between equals. It was the establishment flexing its power against a rising progressive voice who had dared to challenge its authority. Pompeo's stature carried weight. To his allies, he was a statesman, a voice of strength and order. To his critics, he was a relic of a politics that thrived on control, dismissiveness, and a refusal to bend. And when he zeroed in on Crockett's record, he wasn't just critiquing policy, he was performing a familiar maneuver, one designed to remind America, who supposedly gets to speak and who is expected to stay silent. But 2025 America is not the same America Pompeo once commanded. The political battlefield has been reshaped by the ferocity of cancel culture wars, constant churn of viral debates, and a public that no longer consumes politics as quiet governance, but as spectacle, as confrontation, as identity. Every moment is amplified, dissected, memed, weaponized. Every word carries stakes far beyond the walls of Congress. And so this clash became more than an argument about Crockett's record. It became a proxy for something far larger, a tug-of-war over narrative itself. Who gets to define truth in America? The entrenched establishment voice that insists its authority is unshakable? Or the fiery progressive challenger who speaks to the lived realities of those long ignored? Crockett understood what Pompeo perhaps did not, that this battle was never just about her. God Boa voice had become a vessel for something bigger. The people who see themselves in her struggle, for communities tired of being reduced to footnotes, for voters weary of polished dismissals from those perched in power. Every insult Pompeo hurled at her wasn't just his attempt to tarnish her. It was a challenge to everyone she represented. And that is why the silence that followed his attack wasn't empty. It was loaded. The air carried the tension of two Americas colliding, one rooted in the privilege of establishment dominance, the other rising from the grit of identity, truth, and resilience. This wasn't just about a record, one analyst noted later. It was about who defines truth in America. And when Jasmine Crockett stood her ground, it was as though a line was being drawn in real time. On one side, the old guard armored in credentials and condescension. On the other, the new firebrand, wielding authenticity like a blade. The stakes were clear. Whoever won this exchange wouldn't just claim victory in a momentary spat. They would seize control of the narrative that would ripple across headlines, across social feeds, across the very conscience of the nation. And while Pompeo assumed his authority alone could silence her, what came next would shatter that illusion. Because Jasmine Crockett wasn't about to simply defend herself. She was about to flip the attack in a way that no one, not Pompeo, not the audience, not even her most loyal supporters could have predicted. And when she did, the shockwaves would travel far beyond that room. Mike Pompeo's presence in American politics has always carried a certain weight. But weight is not the same as wisdom. He built his image on discipline and power, projecting himself as the man who could walk into any room and command silence. To his admirers, he embodied a nonsense strength, someone unafraid to say what others would not. But peel back the layers of the carefully curated persona, and what emerges is a man addicted not to truth, but to the echo of his own authority. His career is littered with moments that illustrate this addiction. Again and again, Pompeo styled himself as a warrior for free speech, an uncompromising defender of the First Amendment. He thundered against censorship, warning of its dangers when used against voices aligned with his own worldview. Yet time and again, when that principle meant extending a platform to critics, he reached for the mute button, version of free. Speech was not universal. It was conditional, reserved for allies, silenced for opponents. It was less a principle and more a tool of convenience. One deployed to score political points, then quickly abandoned when the same weapon threatened. To pierce his own armor, this contradiction became a defining trait. His confidence, bordering on arrogance, shielded him from self-reflection. Where others saw inconsistency, he saw strategy. Where others saw hypocrisy, he saw strength. It was a paradox he wore with pride, convinced that if he carried himself with enough force, few would dare to question it. But arrogance has a way of blinding those who wield it. Pompeo's style was not subtle. It was domineering. His attacks were not measured. They were broad, dismissive, designed to belittle rather than engage. He prided himself on ending debates, not with reason, but with sheer volume. In this way, he crafted himself into an archetype recognizable in every era of politics. The overconfident insider who mistakes intimidation for influence, who mistakes fear for respect. The irony was that this style, which once gave him an aura of invincibility, became the very crack in his armor. In a media landscape shaped by virality, arrogance reads differently than it once did. The same dismissive tone that silenced rooms in the past now ricocheted across social platforms as evidence of elitism. The same smirk that once conveyed dominance now appeared to millions as a symbol of a crumbling old guard. And Pompeo, so immersed in the performance of his authority, failed to see how the ground was shifting beneath him. He was a man still playing yesterday's game in an arena that had changed its rules entirely. Where once a sharp dismissal would close the conversation, now it opened the floodgates. Where once the establishment narrative held sway, authenticity was the only currency that mattered. Yet Pompeo clung to his methods. He believed his record, his stature, his resume would always be enough to drown out dissent. He believed that condescension delivered with conviction would still carry the day. He believed, perhaps most dangerously, that dignity could be crushed by arrogance. But history has shown what happens to figures who mistake dominance for permanence. For every overconfident politician who thought they could dictate the terms of debate, there comes a moment when the crowd turns, when the silence after an insult doesn't affirm authority, but instead invites a devastating reply. Pompeo had spent years cultivating the image of untouchability. In doing so, he had blinded himself to the possibility of being undone. That is why his attack on Jasmine Crockett carried such weight, not because it was particularly original or devastating, but because it revealed the depth of his blind spot. He treated her as if she were just another target, another opponent to be brushed aside with a dismissive line. He underestimated her resilience, her authenticity, her ability to channel the energy of those who felt silenced. He underestimated not only her voice, but the moment itself, the cultural landscape that no longer tolerated his contradictions. In that instant, Pompeo became more than a political heavyweight. He became an archetype, the embodiment of establishment, arrogance, the symbol of hypocrisy dressed as principle, the villain whose downfall feels both inevitable and necessary. His attempts to dismiss Crockett weren't just an attack on her. They were a performance of everything she stood against: silencing, elitism, the tired assumption that truth belongs only to the powerful. And while he basked in the sound of his own voice, convinced he had delivered another crushing blow, the stage was already being set for something he could not control. For arrogance, no matter how loud, always meets its match. And for Mike Pompeo, that match would arrive in the form of a single reply, sharp as a blade, delivered by the very woman he thought he could silence. The man who built his career on commanding silence was about to be silenced himself. Jasmine Crockett's rise did not begin in the spotlight. It began in the margins, in spaces where voices were often dismissed, where battles were fought without cameras, and where resilience was not a choice but a necessity. She was shaped by hardship, by the weight of expectations, and by the determination to carve out a place where none had been offered. For Jasmine, politics was never about climbing a ladder. It was about breaking down doors that were designed to keep people like her on the outside. Her story was one of grit. She had seen firsthand how communities struggled to be heard, how institutions brushed off the cries of the vulnerable. In those early days, she became fluent in the language of survival, not just for herself, but for everyone who shared her fight. She learned that dignity was not something handed out by the powerful. It was something you claimed, something you defended, something you carried even when others tried to strip it away. That resilience would become her armor. Unlike the polished figures of establishment politics, Jasmine carried her scars openly. She didn't hide the fact that her journey had been tough, nor did she pretend that she had been handed opportunities others couldn't reach. Instead, she wore her experiences as a testament, proof that the voices of the overlooked mattered, just as much as those who had long monopolized the stage. Her reputation grew because she refused to play the game by the old rules. Where others cloaked their words in politeness, she cut through with blunt honesty. Where others built careers on calculated distance, she leaned into authenticity. It wasn't just that she had clapbacks, though she was feared for those. Two, it was that each response carried the weight of lived truth. When she spoke, people listened, not because she was the loudest in the room, but because she spoke with a conviction rooted in something real, and in a political world saturated with spin. That authenticity became her greatest weapon. It connected her two audiences who were tired of platitudes and hungry for honesty. It gave her credibility with communities who saw in her not just a representative, but a reflection. For immigrants, for women of color, for anyone who had been told to sit down and stay quiet, Jasmine Crockett embodied the defiance they wished they could unleash. This was why her voice mattered so much. She didn't simply fight for herself. She fought as though every exchange carried the weight of her community's dignity. Each battle was personal, because every slight, every attempt to silence her, echoed with the long history of attempts to silence people like her. She had learned early that when she stood her ground, she wasn't standing alone. She was standing for generations who had been forced to endure indignities without reply. In this way, Crockett's story became more than biography. It became mythos. She was cast as the truth-teller, the unflinching presence in a system designed to reward compromise and timidity. Her supporters didn't just admire her, they drew strength from her. Each time she spoke, it felt like she was speaking for them, piercing through the fog of political noise with a clarity that resonated far beyond the chamber. It is this background that explains why her confrontation with Mike Pompeo carried such weight. He saw only another political opponent, another name on a record to be torn apart. What he missed was that she had been preparing for this moment her entire life. Every struggle, every dismissal, every attempt to shut her down had built within her a resilience that could not be rattled by establishment arrogance. While Pompeo relied on the force of his resume, Crockett relied on the force of her lived experience, and in an America increasingly skeptical of power without authenticity, hers was the voice that rang true. She knew the stakes instinctively. She didn't need to calculate what this clash meant for her career or her reputation. For her, the stakes were always the same: truth versus distortion, dignity versus dismissal, voice versus silence. And because she lived those stakes every day, she could channel them with a precision that no opponent could match. This was what made her such a formidable presence. She didn't have to pretend. She didn't have to posture. She didn't have to rehearse. She responded. It came from a place Pompeo could never access. The lived reality of communities who had endured far worse than his attacks. Her strength was not just rhetorical. It was spiritual, emotional, collective. It was bigger than her. And so, as the clash unfolded, the imbalance became clear. On one side stood Pompeo, armored in establishment arrogance, convinced his authority would hold. On the other stood Jasmine Crockett, grounded in resilience, sharpened by struggle. Carrying the dignity of those who had long been denied it, she didn't just meet his attack, she absorbed it, reframed it, prepared to turn it back on him with the precision of someone who knew what it meant to fight with everything at stake. Because for Jasmine, every fight is personal, and that is why her words carry weight far beyond the moment. She was not simply ready for Pompeo's attack, she was made for it. And what came next would prove that the power of authenticity, wielded against arrogance, could transform not just a debate, but the entire narrative of a nation. It is this background that explains why her confrontation with Mike Pompeo carried such weight. He saw only another political opponent, another name on a record to be torn apart. What he missed was that she had been preparing for this moment her entire life. Every struggle, every dismissal, every attempt to shut her down had built within her a resilience that could not be rattled by establishment arrogance. While Pompeo relied on the force of his resume, Crockett relied on the force of her lived experience, and in an America increasingly skeptical of power without authenticity, hers was the voice that rang true. She knew the stakes instinctively. She didn't need to calculate what this clash meant for her career or her reputation. For her, the stakes were always the same: truth versus distortion, dignity versus dismissal, voice versus silence. And because she lived those stakes every day, she could channel them with a precision that no opponent could match. This was what made her such a formidable presence. She didn't have to pretend. She didn't have to posture. She didn't have to rehearse. She responded. It came from a place Pompeo could never access. The lived reality of communities who had endured far worse than his attacks. Her strength was not just rhetorical. It was spiritual, emotional, collective. It was bigger than her. And so, as the clash unfolded, the imbalance became clear. On one side stood Pompeo, armored in establishment arrogance, convinced his authority would hold. On the other stood Jasmine Crockett, grounded in resilience, sharpened by struggle. Carrying the dignity of those who had long been denied it, she didn't just meet his attack, she absorbed it, reframed it, prepared to turn it back on him with the precision of someone who knew what it meant to fight with everything at stake. Because for Jasmine, every fight is personal, and that is why her words carry weight far beyond the moment. She was not simply ready for Pompeo's attack, she was made for it. And what came next would prove that the power of authenticity, wielded against arrogance, could transform not just a debate, but the entire narrative of a nation. It is this background that explains why her confrontation with Mike Pompeo carried such weight. He saw only another political opponent, another name on a record to be torn apart. What he missed was that she had been preparing for this moment her entire life. Every struggle, every dismissal, every attempt to shut her down had built within her a resilience that could not be rattled by establishment arrogance. While Pompeo relied on the force of his resume, Crockett relied on the force of her lived experience, and in an America increasingly skeptical of power without authenticity, hers was the voice that rang true. She knew the stakes instinctively. She didn't need to calculate what this clash meant for her career or her reputation. For her, the stakes were always the same: truth versus distortion, dignity versus dismissal, voice versus silence. And because she lived those stakes every day, she could channel them with a precision that no opponent could match. This was what made her such a formidable presence. She didn't have to pretend. She didn't have to posture. She didn't have to rehearse. When she responded, it came. From a place Pompeo could never access, the lived reality of communities who had endured far worse than his attacks. Her strength was not just rhetorical. It was spiritual, emotional, collective. It was bigger than her. And so as the clash unfolded, the imbalance became clear. On one side stood Pompeo, armored in establishment arrogance, convinced his authority would hold. On the other stood Jasmine Crockett, grounded in resilience, sharpened by struggle, carrying the dignity of those who had long been denied it. She didn't just meet his attack. She absorbed it, reframed it, and prepared to turn it back on him with the precision of someone who knew what it meant to fight with everything at stake. Because for Jasmine, every fight is personal. That is why her words carry weight far beyond the moment. She was not simply ready for Pompeo's attack. She was made for it. And what came next would prove that the power of authenticity, and wielded against arrogance, could transform not just a debate, but the entire narrative of a nation. The clash had begun like so many others, a powerful man, brimming with authority, stepping up to reduce an opponent's record to a pile of accusations. Mike Pompeo leaned into his role with ease, his voice sharpened with the kind of condescension honed over decades in politics. He painted Jasmine Crockett's record not as a testament to resilience, but as a series of missteps, distortions, and failures. Each line landed like a hammer: exaggerated claims about her policies, dismissive swipes at her background, sneering implications that she was unfit to lead. To his supporters, it was vintage Pompeo. He relished the role of enforcer, the one who could supposedly expose weakness with a few sharp jabs. He spoke not just to the room, but to the cameras, every syllable polished into the rhythm of attack. He imagined the headlines would belong to him. He imagined his words would hang heavy in the air, unchallenged. But the room told a different story. The more he spoke, the more the silence thickened. The crowd leaned forward, not in agreement, but in anticipation.
Ow.
It wasn't excitement for what Pompeo would say next. It was a collective pause, a bracing, a waiting, because everyone knew that for all his bluster, the real drama would begin when Jasmine Crockett finally decided to speak. And Jasmine, she didn't flinch. She didn't interrupt. She didn't scramble to defend herself against the barrage. She sat steady, poised, her silence louder than his attacks. She let him swing, let him hurl every insult he could muster, and with each one, the anticipation built. Viewers at home began refreshing their feeds, waiting, whispering in group chats. What is she going to say? It was a strategy that seemed almost cinematic. Every insult Pompeo unleashed created not just pressure, but suspense. It was as though the entire moment had slowed down into a long inhale, everyone holding their breath for the inevitable exhale that would come from Jasmine's reply. Her calmness wasn't weakness, it was control. And that control unnerved even those who cheered Pompeo's every word. The spectacle spilled beyond the room. On Twitter, hashtags began to bubble as the clash gained traction. Clips of Pompeo's attacks circulated, framed not as triumphs, but as setups. Memes appeared almost instantly, side-by-side shots of him gesturing wildly while Jasmine sat unbothered, composed, waiting. The online audience, as savvy as ever, knew what was coming. They had seen her before, had witnessed her clapbacks, her sharpness, her refusal to bend. They knew silence wasn't surrender. It was the calm before the storm. Inside the hall, Pompeo pressed on, convinced he had cornered her. He mistook her stillness for vulnerability, her quiet for defeat. He couldn't see what the audience could feel, that each passing second of her composure made his words feel smaller, hollower. He thought he was commanding the stage, but in truth, he was only setting the scene for his own undoing. The tension reached its peak as Pompeo delivered his final jab, the kind of line he believed would echo long after the camera stopped rolling. He paused, waiting for the silence to validate him, waiting for the room to seal his victory with compliance. For a moment, it seemed he might have it. The room was still, the air was tight, and then Jasmine moved. Slowly, deliberately, she leaned forward, the calm in her eyes unshaken. The anticipation shifted from silence into a spark, the sense that something sharp, something unforgettable, was about to be unleashed. The feeds lit up. Phones buzzed. Viewers at home leaned closer to their screens. The entire room seemed to contract into a single second of breathless waiting. And then came the reply that stopped him cold. For a moment, the silence stretched long enough to feel endless. Pompeo's words still lingered in the air, thick with arrogance and dismissal, and every eye turned to Jasmine Crockett. She sat steady, unbothered, as if she had been waiting her whole life for this precise second. Then she leaned forward, her voice low but sharp, slicing through the air like a blade. "Mike," she said, pausing just long enough to let the name hang, casual yet disarming. "The difference between us is simple. You've made a career out of silencing others. I've made mine out of giving them a voice." The words landed with precision, a clean strike that carried the weight of truth. For a heartbeat, the room was frozen. The audience, caught between gasp and applause, waited for Pompeo to fire back. But Jasmine wasn't done. "You say my record is weak?" "Yes. My record is standing up for people you refuse to see. You call that weakness? Then I'll take weakness over willful blindness any day. Because what you call weakness, America calls dignity." Gasps broke into applause, the sound rising like a wave. Some in the crowd clapped instinctively, others shouted approval, their voices slicing through the tension. Phones went up, cameras locked in. This was no longer a debate. This was a moment. Pompeo shifted in his seat, the confidence he had projected minutes earlier faltering as the applause grew. He tried to interject, a half-smirk tugging at his lips. But Jasmine held the floor with a steadiness that commanded respect. "You built your name on foreign policy speeches and closed-door deals," she continued, her cadence deliberate, each word landing like a drumbeat. "I built mine by showing up where the cameras weren't, in neighborhoods, in courtrooms, in communities that never got a seat at your table. That's not weakness, that's service. And if you can't see the difference, maybe it's because you've been looking down on people for so long you forgot how to look them in the eye." The audience erupted again, louder this time, the kind of roar that signals a shift in power. Online, the clips began to spread instantly. Hashtags ignited. Hashtag Crockett clapback. Hashtag Pompeo silenced. Hashtag truth over spin. Memes were already in the making. Split screens of Pompeo's smug expression dissolving into unease. Contrasted with Jasmine's calm, devastating delivery, Pompeo's attempt to regain control was almost painful to watch. He shuffled his notes, his mouth tightening into a forced grin. The kind of grin politicians use when they know they've lost the room but can't admit it. He raised his hand slightly, as if preparing to speak, but the audience noise swallowed him whole. His authority, so firm, so unshakable only minutes before, crumbled under the weight of Jasmine's reply. And Jasmine knew it. She let the applause roll before speaking again, her voice softer this time, but no less sharp. "The truth doesn't need volume to be heard. It only needs courage. Courage is something you can't cancel, no matter how many speeches you give or headlines you chase." The silence that followed wasn't the silence of dominance Pompeo once commanded. It was the silence of recognition, the silence of a crowd realizing they had just witnessed a turning point. Even those who disagreed with her politically couldn't deny the force of what had happened. It wasn't simply rhetoric. It was authenticity clashing against arrogance and winning. In that silence, Pompeo's shoulders sagged ever so slightly. It was a small movement, barely perceptible, but enough to betray the truth. He had been rattled, and everyone could see it. Online, the reaction was immediate and explosive. Twitter feeds flooded with clips. TikToks remixed her words into trending sound bites. Late-night comedians lined up their monologues before the night was even over. What Pompeo thought would be his headline became hers, repeated in bold texts. Across social platforms, you've made a career out of silencing others. I've made mine out of giving them a voice. It wasn't just a reply, it was a reversal. The very attack Pompeo had launched was now turned back on him, sharper than when it was first delivered. His arrogance had set the stage for his own undoing, and Jasmine's authenticity had sealed it. But what made the moment cinematic wasn't just the words. It was the choreography of it all, the stillness before she spoke, the precision of her phrasing, the gasps that punctuated the room, the eruption of applause that built like a soundtrack to his unraveling. It felt scripted, staged for drama, but it wasn't. It was real, and that made it unforgettable. Pompeo finally tried to push back, his voice fumbling for authority. "That's not," he began, but the words faltered. The confidence that had carried him was gone. He looked less like the heavyweight who had entered the room and more like a man struggling to remember his lines. Jasmine didn't even need to interrupt him. His silence was already louder than anything she could have said. For her supporters, it was vindication. For her critics, it was unavoidable acknowledgement. For Pompeo, it was humiliation, the kind that lives forever in viral clips and trending hashtags. The crowd's roar slowly settled into murmurs. But the energy never dissipated. It was the kind of moment people knew they'd be talking about for weeks. A shift, a crack in the establishment facade, captured in the span of a few sentences, and Jasmine, calm as ever, simply leaned back, her point made, her presence unshaken. She didn't need to gloat, didn't need to add another word. She had already won, and everyone knew it. But the real story wasn't Pompeo's silence. It was the storm that followed. By the time Jasmine Crockett left the stage that night, the internet had already erupted into a frenzy. The clip of her reply wasn't just circulating, it was multiplying, refracted through countless phones, feeds, and screens. Twitter, or what most now called simply X, was the epicenter of the quake. Within minutes, hashtags shot to the top of the trending list. Hashtag Crockett clapback sat at number 1. Followed closely by hashtag Pompeo silenced, and the brutal hashtag truthoverspin memes materialized at lightning speed. One viral edit showed Pompeo's stunned expression freeze-framed, captioned with, "When you realize the debate is over and you lost." Another cut his attack side by side with Jasmine's calm reply, setting the contrast to dramatic movie scores. TikTok users chopped her words into sound bites, pairing them with reaction videos, dance remixes, and even mock debates staged in high school classrooms. Jasmine's line, "You've made a career out of silencing others. I've made mine out of giving them a voice," quickly became a trending audio, lip-synced by creators across the political spectrum. Late-night comedians pounced within hours. Monologues opened with clips of the exchange, followed by punchlines that skewered Pompeo. "I haven't seen someone shut down that fast since my Wi-Fi bill was overdue," one host quipped as the audience roared. Another compared Jasmine's poise to a Netflix drama protagonist delivering the final monologue before credits roll. The mainstream comedy circuits had crowned their new viral queen, and the ripple was impossible to ignore. But the phenomenon didn't stop with jokes and memes. Political commentators, influencers, and analysts flooded podcasts, YouTube breakdowns, and Twitter threads with takes that dissected every pause, every expression. Progressive pundits hailed the moment as proof of authenticity, triumphing over empty rhetoric. Conservative commentators scrambled, some downplaying the exchange, others quietly admitting Pompeo had taken a damaging hit. Even centrists couldn't deny the spectacle, one columnist wrote that. Jasmine's line would live in the annals of political clapbacks alongside the greats. The timing of it all made the story even bigger. In an election cycle already fraught with noise, cancel culture showdowns, establishment versus grassroots battles, identity politics headlines, this clash crystallized the tensions of 2025 into a single, unforgettable moment. It wasn't just Crockett versus Pompeo. It was a proxy war for truth versus spin, authenticity versus arrogance, dignity versus dismissal. On Instagram, young voters shared the clip not with policy notes but with captions like, "This is why we need more voices like hers." On TikTok, Gen Z and millennial users crafted compilations of Jasmine's past moments, branding her the queen of the clapback. On Facebook, older audiences debated what it meant for Pompeo's credibility and whether his silence had effectively ended his momentum. Across demographics, the same phrase echoed, "She stopped him cold." Even celebrities jumped in. Musicians, actors, and athletes with millions of followers reposted the viral clip, many adding their own reactions. Laughing emojis, fire emojis, or simple one-word comments like savage. The cultural crossover cemented the moment as more than political. It was pop culture. Cable news couldn't resist either. The following morning, split-screen debates raged across networks. Was it a soundbite battle or a substantive exchange? Was Jasmine's reply merely performance or a genuine articulation of values? For every attempt to downplay the moment, the raw clip spoke louder, replayed endlessly on loop, making it impossible to spin away. Yet beneath the memes, hashtags, and viral fanfare, something deeper began to stir. Commentators noticed it first. This wasn't just entertainment. It was a crack in the armor of political intimidation, a reminder that truth, delivered with clarity and dignity, could still resonate in a cynical age. For communities long silenced or dismissed, Jasmine's words weren't just a clapback, they were validation. A Latina organizer wrote in an op-ed, "When Jasmine said she built her record by showing up where the cameras weren't, I felt like she was speaking for all of us who never make it into the spotlight." That moment wasn't about Pompeo, it was about us. Teachers played the clip in classrooms. Pastors referenced it in sermons about courage and integrity. Activists wove it into speeches, not as a meme but as a rallying cry. The line that began, as a soundbite, was transforming into something heavier, a cultural marker. Proof that in the din of political theater, clarity could cut through. And as the debate raged on, Pompeo's silence became its own kind of haunting refrain. The man who once commanded rooms with volume had been undone by a single, steady voice. But beyond the laughter, beyond the late-night punchlines and the viral dances, one question began to press itself into the national conversation. What does it mean when a moment like this breaks through the noise? Because as powerful as the memes were, what lingered wasn't comedy. It was the quiet after Jasmine's words. The undeniable recognition that something more than a political clash had just taken place, and that something deeper. That undercurrent beneath the entertainment was about to reshape the way America thought about voice, power, and truth itself. Section 8. The resolution/moral lesson, 700 words. When the storm of hashtags, memes, and headlines finally began to settle, Jasmine Crockett stepped forward and reframed the entire clash. She could have claimed victory in the narrow sense. A single soundbite triumph over a heavyweight like Mike Pompeo. But Jasmine wasn't interested in gloating. She saw something bigger, something more enduring. And she made it clear in her post-debate reflections. This was never just about her. It was never just about him. It's not about silencing a man, she said with deliberate calm. It's about refusing to let anyone silence the people who sent me here. That's the difference. With those words, the moment transformed from political theater into something closer to moral teaching. Pompeo's attempt to discredit her, to dismiss her as unworthy, became the archetype of arrogance. Jasmine's reply, sharp yet composed, embodied the opposite, dignity in the face of dismissal. Truth spoken not for applause but for justice. She positioned the clash as part of a larger struggle. Truth versus silencing. Authenticity versus spin. Dignity versus arrogance. In doing so, she tapped into a universal narrative that stretched far beyond the stage. For marginalized communities, for immigrants, For anyone who had been told to know their place or stay quiet, her words weren't just politics. They were permission to stand tall, and she didn't leave it at
A metaphor.
Jasmine reminded her audience of the stakes. When arrogance wins, people lose. When spin wins, truth disappears. But when dignity holds its ground, we all rise. It wasn't just rhetoric. It was a reminder that every community, every family, every individual had felt the weight of being silenced at some point. That emotional honesty hit deeper than any fact check ever could. Because her message wasn't wrapped in numbers or policy jargon, it was wrapped in lived experience, in resilience forged from real struggle. She became not just a politician, defending her record, but a vessel for those who had fought quietly and without applause to be recognized. As commentators tried to reframe the debate, Jasmine's message cut through. She wasn't there to spar for points. She was there to make a promise that authenticity would always outlast performance, that truth would always pierce through the fog of spin. In that moment, she turned what could have been a forgettable skirmish into a story of values, a story that said, courage matters, integrity matters, dignity matters. And that's why the image of Pompeo silenced wasn't just satisfying, it was symbolic. For years, arrogance had seemed untouchable. But Jasmine's calm reply revealed a truth that resonated far beyond. Party lines, power without dignity collapses under its own weight. Her words became a mirror for the audience. People saw themselves. In the struggle, workers dismissed by their bosses, students mocked for speaking up, immigrants told their voices didn't count. They felt the sting of being silenced. They felt the triumph of seeing dignity rise above arrogance. That's why the viral clip didn't fade into the churn of a 24-hour news cycle. It stayed, replayed not just for entertainment, but for affirmation. It reminded people that truth, when spoken clearly, can't be drowned out by bluster. And in closing her reflections, Jasmine left the audience with a line that carried the weight of both a warning and a hope. You can try to cancel the truth. You can try to bury dignity, but they always rise. Always. It was the emotional crescendo the moment demanded, a reminder that authenticity is not fragile, that truth is not temporary, and that the silenced can always find their voice again. And as those words echoed beyond the debate stage, they left the audience with something more than political satisfaction. They left them with an uplifting reflection that even in the noise of 2025, even in the chaos of culture wars and spin, cycles, the values of dignity, courage, and truth could still light the way forward. Because in the end, one reply spoke louder than 1,000 attacks. And that was the real lesson. Mike Pompeo came at Jasmine Crockett with the full weight of his name, his resume, and his arrogance. He attacked her record with the kind of certainty that comes from believing no one will ever dare to push back. But Jasmine did push back. In a single devastating reply, she left him stunned into silence. That silence became the headline. That silence became a meme. But more than that, it became a symbol. A symbol of what happens when truth refuses to bow. When dignity stands tall against arrogance, and if you felt that power, if you felt that, satisfaction ripple through you watching Pompeo fall quiet. You're not alone. Millions of people across the country shared that same moment of validation, of pride, of relief. Because it wasn't just about one politician besting another. It was about something far deeper. Seeing someone speak for every voice that's ever been dismissed, ignored, or silenced. That's why this channel exists, to celebrate those moments when authenticity breaks through the noise. When courage shatters arrogance, when truth rises above the spin. So if this story moved you, if it reminded you why standing up matters, then don't just watch and scroll away. Be part of this community. Subscribe to the channel, share this video, and join us in lifting up voices that won't be silenced. Because every time truth speaks louder than arrogance, it reminds us of who we are and what we're capable of. Together, one attack, one reply, one silence that said everything. And this is just the beginning.